George Washington, our first president, was aware from the moment he took office how important his actions were. Every action he took as president would set a precedent for future generations. Washington's immense popularity ensured that he was free to take whatever actions he saw fit. Washington visited the Congress once to seek their advice on foreign policy. After he did not receive the respect he felt the office of the presidency deserved, he never returned, and limited the Congress's role in foreign affairs to providing consent to treaties. Washington sided with the view of Hamilton, who believed in the implied powers the executive branch held, in contrast to the view of Madison, who maintained a strict interpretation of the Constitution. Only those powers that were enumerated in the Constitution were the ones that the President had. Washington's position on these matters was demonstrated when he issued a declaration of neutrality in the war between Britain and France, claiming that the President alone had responsibility for the conduct of diplomacy. Washington further supported Hamilton's plan for the establishment of a national bank. This move was opposed by those who claimed that there was no inherent power to create a national bank. Hamilton, however, claimed that this was a part of the government's implied powers. Washington took to the field as commander-in-chief to suppress the Whiskey Rebellion, thus asserting the primacy of the federal government. Washington set one additional precedent while in office, that of a two-term president. His refusal to run again set a precedent which was only broken by Franklin Roosevelt on the eve of World War II. Adams' presidency was much less successful than that of Washington. He did not have Washington's popularity. Although he successfully avoided a full-scale war with France over the XYZ affair, his bitter rivalry with both Jefferson and Hamilton resulted in his failure to be reelected president. Adams convinced Congress to pass the Alien and Sedition Acts, two laws of questionable constitutionality. Jefferson followed Adams to the presidency. His election was decided by the House of Representatives. Despite his strongly held view of a strict interpretation of the Constitution, the national government had no powers other than those clearly stated in the Constitution, he undertook a number of actions contrary to this. First and foremost, his purchase of the Louisiana Territory from France. There is no provision in the Constitution for the purchase of additional territory. Jefferson, however, felt that the purchase was so much in the U.S.'s interest that it had to be done. He then went to Congress to approve the treaty. Second, Jefferson dispatched the Navy as commander-in-chief to deal with the Barbary pirates without a declaration of war. James Madison became president in the middle of a crisis in relations with Britain. In 1812, he gave in to pressure from war hawks and declared war on Britain. When the British burned Washington, D.C., Madison and his family were forced to flee the White House. The Treaty of Ghent, which brought the war to a close, was signed in 1814. At the end of the war, few pre-war conditions had been changed. President Monroe, who was immensely popular, covered no new constitutional ground during his presidency. Monroe was the last president elected in a nearly uncontested election. The election of John Q. Adams was decided by the House of Representatives after Jackson actually received more votes. Henry Clay threw his support to Adams, and in return, Adams made him Secretary of State. Jackson was finally elected in 1828, in the first election in which the overwhelming majority of electoral votes were decided by popular vote. It was also the first election where the requirement of owning property had been eliminated as a prerequisite to voting. Thus, Jackson is considered the first popular elected president. Jackson attempted to extend the power of the presidency using his own popularity as a starting point. Jackson used his veto power to oppose the rechartering of the Bank of the U.S. To bring an immediate end to the bank, Jackson ordered the Secretary of the Treasury, William Duane, to remove the deposits from the bank and move them to state banks. When Duane refused, Jackson dismissed him, and then appointed Roger Taney, the interim Secretary of Treasury, while the Senate was in recess. The removal of Duane was controversial, critics claiming the Constitution does not give the President the power of removal. Jackson, on the other hand, claimed that it was incidental to his executive power. The Congress did not confirm Taney as Secretary of the Treasury, making it the first time that a president was denied confirmation for one of his appointees. The Supreme Court later rebuked Jackson for his action in firing Duane. The Van Buren presidency, which followed Jackson, was dominated by the Panic of 1837, the worst economic crisis to date in U.S. history. Tyler, who followed Van Buren after the death of Harrison, continued to use the power of the veto to exercise political power. And although Tyler had little popular support, he proved that a president could control policy by wielding his prerogative powers. Tyler also established the principle that the vice president became the president upon the death of the president, and did not merely assume the powers of the office. Polk, who was elected president in 1844, led the United States into the Mexican-American War. He announced that a detachment of American soldiers had been attacked by Mexican soldiers on American land. Congress immediately accepted this dubious claim and declared war. Polk's successors, Zachary Taylor, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan, were all weak presidents dominated by an assertive Congress. Lincoln, in his vigorous pursuit of the Civil War, took a number of actions that clearly violated the letter of the Constitution. He called for the raising of an army, began construction of Navy ships, purchased military supplies, all while the Congress was in recess. He also suspended habeas corpus. Lincoln justified his actions by stating that they were all done to save the Constitution. The Congress's retroactive support for all of Lincoln's actions gave them legitimacy. Lincoln took the field as commander-in-chief to direct one of the battles of the war, and took his responsibility as commander-in-chief very seriously, actively intervening in the Union's war plans. His activist presidency has allowed him to go down with Washington as one of our greatest presidents. President Johnson was the first and only president to undergo a trial for impeachment. He opposed many of the radical Reconstruction proposals from Congress. Fearing that he would fire cabinet officers who implemented Reconstruction laws, the Congress passed the Tenure of Office Bill. This bill stated that the president could not remove a government officer who received his appointment with the confirmation of the Congress. When Johnson wished to fire Secretary of War Stanton, he tried to get the Senate's approval but was turned down. He then proceeded to fire him anyway. The House of Representatives immediately drew up a bill of impeachment and voted in favor of it. The impeachment then went to the Senate, where the Chief Justice Samuel P. Chase presided. Johnson's opponents believed that they had the necessary two-thirds vote, but Senator Edmund G. Ross, a Republican supporter of regular Reconstruction, voted not guilty, thus upholding the power of the presidency. The next presidents, from Grant to Cleveland, were unremarkable. Congress held sway during most of their administrations. The first modern president was Theodore Roosevelt. He identified national problems and developed national agendas for solving these problems. Roosevelt worked to develop conservation legislation, pioneered workplace reform, and fought large companies. He also had an active foreign policy, sending the American fleet, the Great White Fleet, on a round-the-world voyage. In addition, he nearly single-handedly brought about the construction of the Panama Canal. Roosevelt's single greatest error was promising not to run for a full second term, thus turning him into a lame duck and denying him the ability to continue to work in the office he clearly loved. Taft continued some of Roosevelt's activist policies, particularly his trust-busting. He differed, however, with Roosevelt on conservation policy, a break that Roosevelt felt was a betrayal. Roosevelt decided to re-enter politics and founded a third party, the Progressives. Although Roosevelt and the Progressives outpolled Taft, the Democratic candidate Woodrow Wilson won the election. Wilson became the first president since John Adams to deliver his State of the Union address in front of the Congress. Wilson was a strong supporter of financial reform, instituting the Federal Reserve System, and further strengthening the antitrust laws. Wilson also directed American policy during World War I, initially preserving American neutrality, and then leading the United States to declare war on Germany and the other Central Powers. Wilson's greatest failure was his inability to convince the Senate to approve American membership in the League of Nations, thus ensuring the League's impotence. Wilson's successor was Warren Harding. Harding was an unknown Ohio newspaper publisher who, while he personally was honest, surrounded himself with corrupt officials. His administration was scandal-ridden, but the worst part of the scandals did not become public until after his death. Calvin Coolidge, who succeeded him, made rooting out corruption his first priority. He appointed the dean of the Columbia Law School as Attorney General, and he accomplished that goal. Beyond eliminating the corruption of the Harding years, Coolidge was known as the ultimate do-nothing president. Coolidge was followed by Herbert Hoover, an engineer best known for his brilliant work in food relief in Europe at the end of World War I. Hoover was elected at a time of economic boom. However, soon after his election, the stock market crashed, and the Great Depression began. Hoover believed in a free market solution to the problems brought on by the Depression, thus was unwilling to support any direct government relief. The failures of his policies and the severity of the Depression assured the election of Franklin D. Roosevelt as president. Roosevelt's policies and actions dramatically increased the role and power of the presidency and the government in general. In his first 100 days, Roosevelt proposed and Congress approved dozens of new programs designed to bring relief to the American people and fight the Depression. The veritable alphabet soup of federal programs greatly increased the federal government's role in American life. The many people who were required to run the program swelled the ranks of the U.S. government employees as never before. Roosevelt's central role in drafting the programs made the White House the nexus of government activity. It was also the beginning of the modern presidency, where presidents have had ever larger staffs. The coming of World War II further strengthened the presidency. In the months leading up to the war, Roosevelt took many actions of dubious constitutionality. The worst of these was Roosevelt's agreement with Churchill to swap destroyers for bases. He justified his actions on national security grounds, and Congress, who should have had to approve the agreement in advance, gave its tacit approval when it voted funds to fortify the new bases. America's entry into the war further increased the size and role of the federal government. As the war was ending, President Truman was forced to succeed Roosevelt, who had died of a cerebral hemorrhage. The end of the war did not bring about world peace, but rather the Cold War set in. Thus, the president was responsible for a continued worldwide confrontation with the Soviet Union. The role of the president and the central government continued to be large. President Truman directed American involvement in the Korean War, a war that was not declared, and called a police action. Truman's attempt to seize the steel companies to avert a strike was struck down as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. The court declared that the president did not have unlimited prerogative powers as Truman claimed. The Eisenhower presidency was largely uneventful, with the president seeming more a caretaker than an activist president. Technology, however, had changed the powers of the presidency fundamentally. With nuclear weapons, one of the primary powers of the Congress had become somewhat irrelevant. If it became necessary to respond to a Soviet nuclear strike, there could be no declaration of war by the Congress. Time would not allow it. The power and burden to make that decision would lie solely with the president. In January 1961, a young and vibrant President Kennedy was inaugurated, a stark contrast to the older Eisenhower. His vigor and series of domestic initiatives once again strengthened both the office of the presidency and the national government as well. The Kennedy administration's actions to enforce civil rights in the South and its conflict with state governments represented one of the first confrontations between the federal government and local government since the Civil War. In foreign affairs, The Kennedy administration undertook the Bay of Pigs invasion and the blockade of Cuba, both without congressional approval. President Johnson continued the activist domestic policies of the Kennedy administration. By intensive lobbying of Congress, he was able to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the most comprehensive civil rights legislation since Reconstruction, despite the objections of Southern congressmen. President Johnson prosecuted the war in Vietnam without a declaration of war, using instead the pretext of the Tonkin Gulf resolution that were passed in response to a Vietnamese attack on U.S. ships. The war in Vietnam tore the U.S. apart and destroyed Johnson's presidency to the extent that he decided not to seek a second term. Nixon's presidency has been referred to as the Imperial Presidency. The White House staff grew to unprecedented size, and more government functions were controlled from the White House. Nixon's actions with the invasion of Cambodia resulted eventually in the passage of the War Powers Act, an act that was designed to limit the president's ability to introduce American forces into harm's way. Nixon's actions in the Watergate break-in resulted in a constitutional crisis when he refused to turn over a tape recording to the Watergate Committee. The Supreme Court ruled in a unanimous decision that Nixon's attempt to hold on to the tapes by claiming executive privilege was unconstitutional, and he was forced to turn the tapes over. A short time later, Nixon resigned to avoid impeachment. His resignation followed the earlier resignation of Vice President Agnew, who resigned after being charged with corruption while governor of Maryland. Thus, the new president, President Ford, was the first president who had not been elected to become president. The presidency of Ford and Carter was a period of frustration for the United States, both domestically and in foreign affairs. Domestically, it was a period of stagnation, with high inflation and low growth. In foreign affairs, the United States had to stand by and watch the North Vietnamese conquer all of South Vietnam. Although they were diplomatic successes, such as the Panama Canal Treaty and the Camp David peace accords between Israel and Egypt, the enduring image of Carter's presidency was the takeover of the American embassy in Tehran, the ensuing hostage crisis, and the failure of the rescue mission. In the course of the Reagan administration, the prestige of the office of the president was restored to some degree. Reagan's well-deserved reputation as the great communicator helped restore the confidence in the American president. President Reagan's defense buildup was one of the primary causes of the breakup of the Soviet Union. President Reagan's tax cuts without spending cutbacks were less successful, causing the largest budget deficit in American history.
The presidency of George Herbert Walker Bush will be best known for its foreign policy accomplishments. He successfully navigated both the United States and the Soviet Union to an end of the Cold War. He led the successful invasion of Panama and will be forever known for building an international coalition led by the U.S. That coalition waged a successful war that forced Iraq under Saddam Hussein to withdraw from Kuwait, which it had captured. It was domestic affairs that were the first President Bush's weakness. The U.S. economy entered into a recession during the second half of his term of office, and many perceived him as being out of touch with the average American, and thus he was defeated in the 1992 elections. The Clinton presidency began with a major failure when the president tried to bring about major health care reform and set up a national health plan. His presidency was also plagued by a series of scandals, including one in which the Republicans successfully impeached the president for lying about his sex life. However, the Senate refused to find him guilty and remove him from office. Clinton, during his 2 terms, remained popular and achieved a number of substantial accomplishments, including balancing the federal budget, which resulted in the beginning of a paydown of the national debt. In foreign affairs, the president successfully shepherded the limited U.S. intervention in Bosnia, which brought that civil war to an end. President George W. Bush was the first president to come to office thanks to a Supreme Court decision. Bush was committed to lowering taxes, and he brought about the largest tax cut in U.S. history. President Bush was president when terrorists destroyed the World Trade Center and attacked the Pentagon. The terrorists were based in Afghanistan, and when the host government refused to turn over Osama bin Laden to the U.S. president, Bush ordered a campaign that resulted in the ouster of the Taliban from power in Afghanistan, but did not succeed in capturing bin Laden. President Bush also led the U.S. into a war in Iraq that removed Saddam Hussein from power. That war, however, led to a destabilization of Iraq, which led to a near civil war, which the U.S. was forced to participate in. The combination of record tax reductions and 2 wars brought the U.S. budget deficit to unprecedented levels. Near the end of the Bush presidency, the U.S. financial markets collapsed, and President Bush was forced to intervene to steady the markets and prevent a full financial meltdown. In November 2008, the U.S. elected the first African-American president, Barack Obama. President Obama faced the unprecedented challenges of a financial recession and 2 inherited wars.
President Obama, who was the first African-American president of the United States, had a number of accomplishments. First and foremost, the passing of the Affordable Care Act, the first comprehensive health care reform in the United States since the Johnson administration. Second of all, he oversaw the elimination of Osama bin Laden, the terrorist who was responsible for 9/11. Under Obama, the United States reached an agreement, together with other nations, with Iran to limit its nuclear program. President Obama was followed by President Trump. President Trump successfully lowered taxes and appointed 3 Supreme Court justices. However, his presidency was followed by turmoil and questions, especially around his handling of the COVID-19 crisis. He was also impeached but not convicted for his actions relating to Ukraine. Finally, he was impeached again after his support of rioters who took over the Capitol building and tried to stop the election of President Biden. President Biden successfully passed a number of major legislative packages, including a bipartisan infrastructure bill and a bill to try to bring back manufacturing to the United States. However, the Obama administration was loose on border policy, which made it very unpopular amongst parts of the country. President Biden was widely considered to be enfeebled in the last months of his presidency, and while he planned to run for re-election, he pulled out in the last minute. And as a result, President Trump became the next president of the United States.